right, everybody, David Parsons here. This is Nostalgia Trap. I hope you are ready. I think I am ready. Got a really great guest for you today. Had a really fun time talking with him. His name is Joseph Clark. He's the author of a really great book called News Parade, The American Newsreel and the World as Spectacle, out now from University of Minnesota Press. And he's an American Studies guy, and I'm so jealous of the people that got their PhDs in American Studies, because it seems like a much more expansive discipline than the regular old fuddy-duddy history departments that populate graduate schools across this nation, at least for the next few years until the whole enterprise is over. But that's another story. We had a really fun time talking about news, talking about media, talking about spectacle, and the idea of a public sort of being created through newsreels, through training a certain sort of entertainment aesthetic connected to news or reality or history. Joe has so much to say about this, and I'll let him say it because he says it so much better than I do. But, you know, I say it several times throughout this conversation that Joe's work and his book make me think really deep thoughts about where we're at. And I think it connects to a lot of the big themes that we try to develop on this show. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. This is part of a round of writers and scholars that we are featuring from the Contingent Magazine 2020 book list, which has a lot of great books on it. And I know we'll get to more of them. But you know what Contingent does is so close to what Nostalgia Trap is trying to do, which is to be a place where we can share the voices of really smart people who are deeply trained in their disciplines who have not found a place in the academy. And that's due to, you know, all the economics and politics of where higher education is at that we've done many episodes about on this program. But either way, more and more, I see the mission of Nostalgia Trap as sharing those voices and as being a place where we can develop ideas that aren't being developed in the academy because so many scholars are completely shut out. So that's a much larger story. But all of that is just to say, thanks for the supporters of the show. Nostalgia Trap has been around since 2014, and it's helpful to sort of clarify that mission, to hear from people who listen to the show and tell me that that's what they listen to it for in part. And we do a lot of other stuff on the show, but I just wanted to thank our supporters. And if you want to be part of that community, more than half of our content is actually on our Patreon page for subscribers only. You can do that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap and support and grow these sorts of projects, because to me, this is, I don't know what the future of the Academy is, and we're actually going to have Joe on again because he's active in a number of different organizations that are about precarious labor. In fact, there's one called the Precarious Labor Organization, or PLO, that's part of the Society for Cinema and Media Studies. You know, there's a little bit of an insurgency of young, pissed off scholars who are still sort of trying to change the situation for ourselves and for future graduate students and future scholars as well. So this is a really important historical moment, and I thank Joe for coming on and talking to me, and I know he'll be back again. Enjoy this episode. Here is me talking with Joe Clark. Okay, well, Joe Clark, thanks so much for joining me. I found your work and your book on the Contingent Magazine's 2020 book list. And just to get it out, I want to make sure we get the plug first. Your book is called News Parade, The American Newsreel and the World as Spectacle. Definitely caught my eye in every way. I mean, I guess we can start with a very like NPR type question if you want, which is sort of like why newsreels? How did you get to newsreels? I know it was your dissertation in graduate school, but why that particular area of film studies?
It's a long and winding story. I think it probably goes back to when I read John Reed's Insurgent Mexico. And there's a little snippet of an anecdote in there about how Pancho Villa sold the rights to his war to the Mutual Film Company. And it's just a kind of like throwaway anecdote to show you how kind of supposedly show you how kind of craven Pancho Villa was, or media savvy, depending on your point of view. And when I was working on a master's here in Vancouver at the University of British Columbia, I was working with a Mexican historian. He was sort of an early mentor, and although I wasn't particularly interested in Mexican history, I was drawn to him because he was one of the few cultural historians and working in the kind of methods that I wanted to work in. And this story from Insurgent Mexico kind of stuck in my head. So I wrote my master's thesis on newsreel representations of Pancho Villa, film representations of Pancho Villa and the Mexican Revolution, and that got me thinking about it. And essentially, writing my master's thesis, what all grad students should do is they noticed like a gap. I noticed a gap in the historiography. There was no book since Raymond Fielding's 1972 book, The American Newsreel. There'd be no book about newsreels since then.
Wow.
And yeah, so
that's amazing. Because I think of them. I think of the field of media history, and I think of popular figures, from I don't know. I think of McChesney or Chomsky, people like that. People seem to know that media is really important and want to study it. And newsreels are they're, to me, such an important, it's kind of amazing to me that there was that gap.
Yeah, it was amazing to me at the time as well. And I think, there's a lot of reasons for it. One is that I think people thought they understood what it was. I think a lot of thinking around newsreel saw it only as propaganda, particularly through a lens of kind of wartime propaganda. Yeah. And, during wartime, the newsreel companies, the studios, did become, basically propaganda arms of the U.S. government, using a pool system. And, they cooperated closely with the military and the Signal Corps. But, before the war, they were, there was a ideological diversity to some extent, and they were, they weren't propaganda in any kind of narrow sense of that term, anyway. So I think that was part of it, and I think the other big part is that they're part of the film industry, but they don't fit neatly into, at least not until recent turns in film studies. They didn't really fit into, film studies approaches, because it doesn't lend itself at all to a kind of auteurist approach to study, because there's no, it's a super kind of industrialized process where it's meant to kind of flatten out the individual, except maybe the commentator's voice, but the camera operators and the editors and so on are doing a job, and it's very kind of industrial, kind of an industrial production process. So I think people in film studies kind of didn't see it as part of their field, and people in media studies or news studies ignored it because they thought it was superficial, or hadn't developed into what TV news, or didn't have the impact maybe that TV news did later on. So it just kind of escaped notice.
Well, I guess the popular perception, and I include myself as a historian of the 20th century, I always tend to go to the easy stuff and show exactly what you're talking about. World War II newsreels, I think, is what people think of. And I have a little bit of a hint because my parents grew up in the 1950s and 60s and talk about how going to the movies was a very different experience. And they watched, especially in their early life, really young in the 50s, they watched whole programs that included, short films, serials, the cliffhangers and that sort of stuff, cartoons. But they always talked about the newsreels too. I'm wondering if you can give us an idea of what's the golden age of newsreels be outside of World War II? In other words, what is that world like? Yeah.
I think it is the 1930s. Newsreels begin in the early teens. In basically 1911, their first newsreels begin, and at that point, during the silent era, it was they were. Actualities had been part of film programs from the very beginning. But newsreels were a way to kind of make those actualities still interesting to people and to conform to new industry standards, which was like the single reel was kind of the unit of measurement during that period. And so instead of a 2-minute actuality, now you put 5 of those together and you had a 1-reel newsreel. And so it was a way of kind of conforming to that industrial standard. And then they sort of take on a bit new relevance during World War I, when suddenly an interest in the news is heightened because of the war. And so post World War I is when you begin to see a real flourishing of the newsreel. You get local newsreels, and even theaters like the Strand Theater in New York were making their own newsreels, where they were taking from all of these like other newsreels and creating their own kind of custom newsreels. And then essentially, the studio consolidation process of the 1920s that basically gives us the Hollywood studio system. Then the newsreels kind of cement around that system itself, and each of the studios essentially have their own newsreels. And so I argue in the book, and I think that the 1930s really is the golden age of the newsreel, beginning with the Lindbergh transatlantic voyage. Sort of, that's the first kind of peacetime newsreel story that cuts through, and where people are going to the movies to see the news rather than, as you point out, the newsreel was part of the movie-going experience. It was always one of the things people watched before the feature, but it was a rare story that cut through and drew people to the theaters to see the newsreel as the kind of primary attraction. And Lindbergh did that. And then through the 30s, you've got like the rise of fascism in Europe, the Spanish Civil War, and the Sino-Japanese War, as kind of these major international events, which American spectators are really fascinated by. And the spectacle of war, which is something that they hadn't seen before, is now for the first time the real spectacle of war, quote unquote real, is put on screens for them. So I do think it's the 1930s. By the post-war, the newsreel survives into the 1960s, but by that point, by the 1950s, you get television news, which is beginning to kind of compete with the newsreel, and that kind of its influence wanes. So I think it's through the 30s and obviously through the war itself that the newsreel, is in its most influential period. Yeah.
It's funny because we grew up with, and I'm sure you grew up with too, sort of a lot of hand wringing all the way to today about the confluence of news and entertainment, and just like, how that's ruined things. And there, but it seems like what you're identifying here is something like really at the root. I mean, I love the idea that you're talking about, like how an audience is kind of created here, and associating the news with going to the movies and sort of that spectacle, but. Was there that hand wringing then? Were people thinking, well, this is sort of a dangerous direction to go, or we're playing with forces that might unleash a different kind of reality? Because it seems like that's what your work is touching on. Some really, really, it made me think deep thoughts about sort of looking at screens and history as spectacle.
Yeah, I think there is a fair bit of hand wringing at the time. I mean, on both sides. There's hand wringing from the point of view that that the newsreel is superficial and trivial, and that's a critique that makes some sense. I mean, a lot of newsreel stories were trivial in part because they had to have this weekly schedule, and so occasionally there were news stories that had compelling visual elements and could, attract audiences. But a lot of the time, the newsreels included sports stories, fashion, like lots of natural disasters, but also just kind of novelty stories, like dogs that can, sing the national anthem, and, that kind of thing, like a kid that plays the piano with his feet and that kind of stuff. So there was a lot of concern that it was overly trivial, just as there is today with our concerns about social media or about television news, and there was concern that it was overly sensational, right? That it was there was stories about people fainting in the audience, about when there was graphic imagery, and in some cases newsreels were censored, usually to remove graphic imagery of death and that kind of thing. But then on the flip side, there were people who worried that the newsreel was it was too superficial, and that it wasn't living up to its duty to history, to document the real events, right? Because it veered into triviality and so on.
Yeah, is it journalism? I think is kind of the question, and my question too is sort of like, did people conceive of it that way? Was there a desire to go and see only newsreels? Because it seems like that's what television ends up being in some ways, and like 24-hour news ends up being almost like fulfilling the prophecy here of just like nonstop, quote unquote reality images. But I'm wondering about that. I'm wondering about the sort of aesthetic of these newsreels. But I guess go back to the journalism thing first, because my question is sort of like, who are the people that are making these newsreels, and how are they connected to? Because this is a robust time in American newspaper history, right? I feel like newspapers are the main source of news at this point. And so we're transitioning in some way to this much more graphic form of news. Are they the same people? Are there a lot of news people from the newspaper world that are entering into that? Are there journalists, or is this more a Hollywood production?
The photographers certainly moved back and forth between being still photographers and camera operators in the newsreel industry. I less so. I haven't found much evidence of editors and the writers, such as there were, moving between kind of print journalism and the newsreel. I think that they. So the newsreel was very much tied to the studio system, although there were instances where they had relationships with the print media. So MGM and Hearst newsreels, and obviously Hearst newsreels had a relationship with the Hearst newspapers as well. But the way that the newsreel ties to the newspaper, I think, is kind of an extension of the illustrated supplement, right? And of the news magazines like Life magazine and so on, which were also big in the 1930s. Right. So I think it is less to do with the daily newspaper and more to do. There were also connections with radio, which is also emerging during this period. Right. Right. Period where the narrators of the newsreel were often radio personalities that were then brought in to do the commentating on the newsreel. So it was tied to all of these other media worlds. But whether or not it was conceived as journalism, the people who studied and thought about journalism did not see it that way. That's for sure. They saw it as, trivial and a kind of dilution of serious journalism.
Right.
And I guess I argue in the book that it was a dilution, but it was also journalism. And as you point out, I basically argue that it looks forward to a new, like, people at the time thought of it as this corruption of what journalism was, but it really was an indication of where journalism was going to go, more interested in the visual and the spectacle, and that's ultimately the journalism, a big part of the journalism that we ended up with, for better and for worse, right? Like, in lots of cases, spectacular images helped motivate huge positive changes in society. So I don't completely want to say that a move away from information towards spectacle is always regressive or reactionary.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's a really important point, actually, because it's more about sort of understanding the power of these things, and then understanding how different people who have been in control of that power have used it. I mean, we can talk a little bit about Charles Lindbergh, because it seems like that's to me, a figure that is sort of, when I think of him, you mentioned the rise of fascism earlier. I think of him as sort of this figure that's sort of touching a lot of different really important strands in the early and mid 20th century, and particularly like the World War II story. But how does Lindbergh figure into the newsreel story? Because I think what you're identifying is something that is one of those things that falls outside of our Frank Capra U.S. government produced World War II newsreels. How does Lindbergh fit into this?
Yeah, I mean, he is this kind of, I mean, he's an interesting figure because he keeps coming up in the story. So I ultimately kind of kept coming back to Lindbergh. He is in some ways the first newsreel celebrity because his transatlantic flight coincides with the introduction of sound in the newsreel. So the Fox newsreel introduced their sound. They had one issue of their sound newsreel before the issue covering Lindbergh's transatlantic flight, his takeoff, which actually they filmed by accident because they went to the airfield to film another guy who was going to do a much more famous and likely to succeed aviator. But Lindbergh was on the same airfield. So they filmed him taking off, thinking, okay, there you go. And then it turned out he was the one who managed because there was lots of people trying to do it at the time. But so Lindbergh but it's not so much the flight, although the flight is obviously a newsworthy story. What I think his personage, his celebrity represents the newsreel best is that it's his return to the United States and the kinds of ticker tape parades and his being celebrated by these huge crowds. And the newsreel is sort of set up to record those kinds of events, right? It's not particularly good at filming airplanes crossing the Atlantic, right? You can show them taking off, and maybe if you're lucky, show them landing. But a flight in itself is not. It's hard to shoot with a newsreel. But parades, as the title to my book implies, are actually a really important part of newsreels at the time because they're scheduled. So cameras are still pretty cumbersome things in the 1930s. You usually have to shoot with a tripod. And so shooting parades is actually like the action moves, right? You can stay still and things move past you. So you get lots of different shots, lots of different things. And so parades turn out to be, they happen on time. Lots of people are there. They're still pretty spectacular. And you don't have to move the camera a lot. So like inauguration parades, St. Patrick's parades, but also these ticker tape parades for big celebrities who had achieved things. And Lindbergh's is the first that gets captured with the sound newsreel. And so these images of him moving through the kind of the streets of New York, like down Fifth Avenue, I think work as a kind of metaphor for the parade, for the newsreel as well. They're an ideal newsreel subject, but it's also these crowds gathered to see celebrity, right? And in a way, that's how the newsreel operates, is it shows you these passing spectacles that move past you on the screen, just as the parade moves past you on the street, and you're joined in a kind of collective experience, much like the parade spectators are joined in that kind of collective experience. So I think there's a kind of metaphorical way, and then the newsreel uses that metaphor itself. The news parade is a common title for newsreels, and there's trade magazines refer to cover the newsreels in like sections that they call the news parade. So there's this idea that the newsreel is a kind of parade of images that passes in front of you. And Lindbergh is kind of the quintessential image. He's a celebrity, so he has that. He does something like daring and dangerous. He sets a world record. He does all these things that like fit the category of celebrity that make him the perfect newsreel subject. But then he does his like heel turn in the 1930s and starts
literally, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there you go. Yeah, I mean, in between, there's the Lindbergh kidnapping, which also
That's right. I mean, I think about the Lindbergh baby. I mean, to me, that's frequently cited as sort of the first major celebrity tabloid story in the newsreels, at least. Certainly not the first celebrity tabloid story, period. But Yeah, it makes me think about that stuff, and I love that idea of the parade. I'd never really thought about it that way before, the news parade and everything, because it seems like there's a constant trope during the beginnings of film, and this sort of media, almost like use the forms of entertainment that were immediately preceding it, and try to imagine, how to fit them into this new technology. So it would, definitely make sense visually too, of just the motion of a parade is exactly like a film. That's great.
Yeah, on all kinds of metaphoric levels.
Mm-hmm.
But just to go back to Lindbergh and his heel turn, I mean, so I talk about the kidnapping. He That's an important story in terms of the newsreel and media in general, because it's the first trial where moving picture cameras are in the courtroom, somewhat against the judge's wishes. And it's as a result of that case, essentially, that, cameras are banned from courtrooms in the United States, basically for the next until the 1990s, basically, cameras are banned from courtrooms as a result of what they did during the Lindbergh trial.
Wow. Yeah. I didn't know that. It's funny. I just watched the OJ thing on Netflix, and I'm like, again, we talk a lot about the 90s on this show because we're narcissists, and that's when I came of age. But all this stuff was very much present in the culture in the 90s, like all this concern about the line between entertainment and quote unquote reality, but also court TV. I mean, it was pre-OJ, the Menendez brothers trial. There were a bunch of like big televised trials, and it became, I think it's still a conversation.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Yeah. And those are the first, it's really, I guess, an end of the 80s or early 90s. I forget exactly when the Menendez trial was, but those are the first really televised trials, exactly because of the supposed impact of the Lindbergh footage. The newsreels had arranged that they could film like when court wasn't in session, like filming people coming in and so on, but then they illicitly filmed during Lindbergh's testimony. That's when they got kicked out.
And would that footage have been in newsreels? So that people
absolutely
the trial of the century at that point.
100%. And it's interesting because people were following the trial in newspapers and on the radio. So they were getting kind of daily updates. The newsreel during this period was twice weekly. So you wouldn't go to the newsreel to get a kind of update on the facts, right? You would have gotten that from your evening newspaper, right? That could have covered the events of the day even. And the radio broadcasts had like legal experts and other kinds of people. They didn't have live radio feeds from inside the courthouse, but they had, opinion and analysts talking about what had happened during the court case. But the newsreels, so what they had that none of those other media had, they didn't have the most up-to-date facts, but they had the images and the sound of the witnesses for the first time. And so they offered audiences kind of the idea is you can be the jury, you can make up your own mind, you can see Lindbergh, you can see Bruno Hauptmann, the accused, on the stand and hear him give testimony and decide for yourself whether you believe him. And they played that up. They would show an image of him and it's like, is this man guilty? What do you think?
That's so interesting, because I was about to say, oh, well, there's the jump, because now you get your facts from the radio and the newspaper, and then you get some other element. And I was going to say, oh, that's the entertainment spectacle element. But what you identified there is there's also still this sort of civic duty democracy thing in it. It seems like that's a really key, and correct me if I'm wrong, but a really key theme in your book is this tension between sort of, what is this doing to us? Like, is this turning us, is this a tool of democracy in which people are now involved in the news in a way they never were before? Or are they also becoming sort of passive spectators of the news, where they're just consuming it as part of a program of entertainment?
Yeah, and I think that tension runs through the book, because I think that tension is just as whenever new media come on the scene, there's that tension present, right? Is how I think we have a tendency to want to designate it one or the other, right? This, and see it as overdetermined. But really, these effects are, first of all, they're multiple and uncertain at the time. So it's not, as you point out, it's unclear at the time how this will affect audiences. And I think legitimately there are ways in which an increasing emphasis on the visual actually does engage audiences in a different way. Certainly it's more democratic in the sense that, it engages audiences with low literacy. It engages audiences with less fluent in the majority language, English in this case, right? And they can engage in the newsreel. And the newsreel is a public, as another thing I argue in the book, that it's a public sphere. Radio and television after it are essentially mostly consumed in private, although they create a kind of public sphere through the technology, but are consumed more or less in private. And newspapers are individual experiences, whereas the newsreel, because of its theatrical presentation, that is presentation in the theater, is one that we share, we experience collectively as a crowd, as part of a crowd, which was also this is a moment of the masses, right? This is, that's what fascism is about, is like a kind of mass movement, but it's also what kind of mass mobilization on the left is about thinking about the masses. And in a way, the newsreel is a kind of mediated version of the masses, for better and for worse. And so there are, and again, just to go back to Lindbergh, I have a whole chapter devoted to kind of the viewing experiences of the newsreel as well. And one of the kind of key bits of evidence that I have is I found an audio recording. It's at a museum in Wyoming. I found this. It's a vinyl record that was an audio recording of a March of Time newsreel about Hitler. It was called Peace by Hitler. It was an ironic title. And what they did is they just recorded the audio of the audience watching the film, and the film, and you hear the audience clapping at certain points and booing and hissing at certain points. So it's, what this is like very valuable information for a historian of media, because the hardest thing for historians of media is to know how audiences responded to the images that we're thinking about, right? And you can have newspaper reports that talk about booing in the movie theaters, and they were these kinds of in the 1930s, at least, a much more vocal crowd was present. And the newsreel theaters, there were theaters dedicated to showing newsreels in big cities. They were even more prone to that kind of vocal audiences, because people came in and out. There wasn't like a beginning of a program and an end of program. It was a continuous program. And so, but this newsreel was from Radio City Music Hall. So it wasn't from a newsreel theater. It was from a regular movie palace, not regular. It was a huge downtown New York movie palace. But what's interesting is Lindbergh features in that film because they talk about the America First campaign, and he gets booed by the audience.
Wow.
And so, when we talk about his heel turn, I have, a recording of this audience in New York booing Lindbergh and his campaign to keep. So this comes just as Roosevelt is sort of mobilizing to help Britain kind of resist German air bombing, but before the United States, like before Pearl Harbor. So
that's what I was going to ask. I was like, wow, that's pre-Pearl Harbor. What a great piece of evidence. And also too, like the idea that there's an interest in recording the audience's reaction. Like it's another part of that thing you're showing us, is this sort of idea that the newsreels played some civic role.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, what had happened was a previous edition of the Time Marches On film series had caused a lot of controversy. Their first film about Hitler a couple of years earlier, and they'd been criticized from both sides. Some people had said it was anti-German. Some people had said that it was too radically pro-German, or had given Hitler a kind of easy go of it. And so this was their next attempt to make a film about what was happening in Europe. And so I think they were, I don't know that this is why this particular audio recording was made, but I suspect the reason it was made was because the producers were worried about what audiences would do, because there had been fistfights and violence at some of the showings of the previous film. So there was some nervousness. So
it's interesting though that they're thinking about audience reaction to the news, and sort of how and like the focus group, what news are they going to like? I mean, it really does prefigure how much the news is sort of manipulated in that way it's clickbait, right? Like there's sort of like, it's making me think now that I did research in grad school in the 1960s and 1970s media and counterculture and anti-war movement and things like that. And you probably heard that there was an organization called Newsreel in the 60s, made by these independent left people. And I watched a bunch of those. They're hard to find actually. But it seems like I wonder what you could say about the sort of decline of the newsreel, because it seems like that 60s group, those counterculture kids were trying to kind of bring back the newsreel or at least use the idea of it when it was really a television world at that point. Yeah,
100%. So, just to go back a little bit to why no one's written about the newsreel, just an interesting anecdote is that I early on, when I was still writing my dissertation, I remember, I went to conferences, and I remember chatting with a couple of senior film scholars, significant film scholars in the field of documentary, which is sort of where my work often fits in that kind of conference world. And I mentioned that I was working on newsreels, and frequently scholars of a certain generation, boomer scholars, immediately assumed that I was working on California newsreel, third world newsreel of the 1960s, because that's what they associated with it. And, as I mentioned, my version of studio newsreels don't fit neatly within kind of narratives about film history, but those ones do, because lots of film scholars come from a kind of Marxist critical point of view, and those films, wonderful films, I'm not criticizing the films at all, but they fit within that kind of narrative, and they have within the idea of radical film in the 1960s and its effect.
It's the new left.
Exactly.
Newsreel was the new left's film cooperative.
Yeah, and for sure, there are wonderful examples, like great work done on the sit down strikes I forget what the name of the film is. There's a wonderful one about kind of Black Power movements and their work with certain parts of the labor movement in Michigan. Forgetting what that title is, but and how they had to battle both against the bosses and the UAW at the time.
That stuff is priceless. Where do you find the newsreel stuff? You probably know better than I do. I feel like a lot of it is not on YouTube or even archive.org.
Yeah, I suspect that one I think I did find on YouTube. I'll look it up and see if I can find it. But Third World Newsreel continues to exist as a distributor, and so some of their films, like the Black Panther film, and there's a few others that are still part of their collection, and they distribute those.
That's good to know. I just watched the Agnes Varda Black Panther film, and it made me. I was just thinking, God, we think we know so much about this stuff, but we don't watch very much footage like this. It's very rare, to see this kind of, which is interesting because we're not even talking about the 30s. We're talking about the late 60s.
Absolutely. It's incredible how, the point I always make to my students is what we remember of film history is such a tiny sliver. And that's true in the 60s, and it's certainly true in the 30s, and even more true, in the silent era. I often teach that Agnes Varda film alongside the California Newsreel Black Panther film, because it's so interesting to see Varda's point of view as kind of an outsider. And it's a beautiful film, but it's very much a kind of anthropological, observational film from the outside.
Yes.
Dispassionate in a way that the newsreel films, the Third World Newsreel, can't remember it. California Newsreel, Third World Newsreel, it changes its name, and I can't remember exactly when it changes. But theirs is a much more committed bit. Theirs is propaganda. They're advocates in a way that Varda isn't, and so I use that often as a way to talk about what advocacy filmmaking.
That's great.
How that works in relation to more traditional documentary forms.
Totally different conversation. But now I'm like, where's the authorial voice in the Varda film? You know what I mean? Because there is an authorial voice there, right? Even if it is a remove.
Yeah.
That's really good stuff. I want to bring up your website really quickly, because you have a bit about who you are. And what you study that really caught my attention. Your research and teaching interests focus on archival and non-theatrical media, including newsreels, home movies, and sponsored film. I think I'm interested in sort of how did you get interested in this sort of outside world? Because I feel like so many film studies, when people think of film studies, they're like, oh, this is the guy that's going to tell us about Taxi Driver, and 2001: Space Odyssey. I studied films in the 90s, and I feel like there are cultural moments when you're in school, whatever you're studying. And certainly I went to school during the Tarantino 90s with a very particular kind of film school culture. But how did you get to this sort of stuff? Because I think this, to me, I love your work, and I love what you're investigating, because it feels like so much of this is lost material. I mean, I know Scorsese. Speaking of Scorsese, made a whole movie about the lost films of the silent era. But it feels like, a whole world of VHS stuff is going away right in front of our eyes too. So, I mean, I guess that's a big question, but.
Oh, it's a huge question. I'm part of, I think, I'm not alone in this interest. So non-theatrical, or sometimes called useful cinema, has emerged in the last 10 or 15 years as a subfield within film studies. And I was already working on my dissertation when I encountered it as a category, and decided that I could fit newsreels into that category, despite the fact that they're very much a theatrical presentation, so they don't neatly fit within it. But I felt marginal to film studies in the same way that lots of folks who are working on these kinds of films feel marginal to film studies. And essentially, it's we're interested in film culture outside of the entertainment industry and outside of the kind of artistic avant-garde and narrative cinema, or even kind of auteur documentary. And in part, it's the great work of archivists and preservationists are finding these works. And there's the Orphan Film Symposium was really formative for me. It was started by Dan Strebel at the University of South Carolina. He's now at NYU. But the Orphan Film Symposium kind of brings a lot of these groups together, where we talk about films that have been orphaned in one way or another, forgotten for various reasons, sometimes because they're mislaid and then have to be rediscovered, but sometimes because they were disavowed for one reason or another as well. And so we're interested in educational film, government-sponsored film. I personally, my new project is looking at industrial film, especially in the logging industry in Canada, which was very prolific where I am. I'm in Vancouver, where the logging industry obviously was a big part of the 20th century. And they used film a lot. And so those are films that I'm interested in. But also, as you point out, home movies and other bits of film that typically wasn't watched in a commercial movie theater. They're usually watched in schools or church groups, or so some people work on religious film, for example, and they're used in Sunday schools and that kind of thing. So this is something that increasingly we're learning was I always make this point to my students as well, is, this kind of cinema that was shown outside of movie theaters, actually constitutes the bulk of, if you measure film in feet, in celluloid, right?
Right.
The bulk of the 20th century film production and distribution was in this kind of film, right? 16 millimeter film that was made for school use, basically.
Yeah.
And so if we don't take accounting of that, then we're actually ignoring the ways in which people encountered movies and film in the 20th century, right? We were just focusing on, a certain kind of filmmaking, the commercially and entertainment industries, rather than the multiple uses of film that happened throughout the 20th century.
Yeah, I mean, I want to hear more about the industrial filmmaking around logging, because it makes me. I mean, I've had the kind of life where I've had different jobs that have shown me, training videos about workplace harassment, or seeing like DMV videos, driving videos. I feel like are very, very common.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
what's the angle on the logging industry? Because that seems like a really ripe space for all the politics you're talking about, including, labor, capitalism, etc.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, that interest kind of grew out of like I'm sort of building on work in eco cinema, Adrian Ivakov and people like that, who are thinking about cinema as kind of world building spaces. And I'm trying to think about, as well as also thinking about extraction cinema. So cinemas, I'm thinking about logging films principally, but that has lots of impact on representations of Indigenous people in Canada and the United States, where they are erased from the landscape in these logging films. But at the same time, anthropological films and government films about Indigenous, culture are doing other kinds of extraction work, where they're taking that culture and imagining its erasure in other ways. And so I'm thinking about film as a technology of, in this case, deforestation. Essentially, the ways in which we think about these industrial films. They have an instrumental purpose, right? They're designed to instruct. Sometimes they're instructional films for workers, right? Safety films, but they're often also for school children about the wonders of the industry, or they're promotional in purpose. But in all of those cases, they help to imagine the forests as a kind of managed resource, often very explicitly saying we're farming trees now. The forests are farms. And so part of what I'm trying to think through is how film actually, it doesn't just have a kind of ideological effect, but it's actually having a material effect on the landscape. So the landscape of the forest is literally changing in response to these filmic images. And so, I like what I've been sort of thinking about is that, like, the film cameras are like chainsaws, like a technology of resource extraction.
Oh,
so,
wow! What a great you're good with these metaphors, man.
I guess I think that way. I have to think through them.
But they're really useful. I don't think of them as gimmicks. I think that these metaphors really get at something really important about the history you're telling. And God, I'm thinking about this film Hell's Highway. You may have seen this. It came out years ago. It was a documentary. It's a film that it collected all the sort of those like blood on the asphalt, red asphalt drivers training films that were shown to drunk drivers and teenagers to scare them about the dangers of driving recklessly and drunk driving, etc. So it turns out that all those films were made by like one guy in the 60s who basically went and had a police scanner and had a relationship with law enforcement and was able to go get to the scenes of these horrific car crashes very soon after they happened and got really graphic, bloody footage. And that stuff kind of like whole generations of people saw the same footage over and over and over again. It reminds me of like Faces of Death type stuff. And again, the world that I grew up in. But I just wanted to tell this story really quickly because I went and saw Hell's Highway in New York City Me and my friend, we're the only people in the audience. There's nobody there. When we walked out, it was a small art theater. When we walked out, we said, we're the only people here. Are we the only sick people that came and saw this movie? And the guy at the movie theater said, there's only one other person that has seen this movie this entire week, and it was Stephen King. And so, it seemed appropriate. But
Yeah,
there's a hunger for that sort of weird, footage that at the same time, the idea of people watching this as education is just intense.
Yeah. If people are interested, they should seek out AV Geeks. They have a website. They preserve these films, and they have a Facebook live feed where once a day they just screen old educational films. Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah.
That's really cool. So yeah, it feels like one of the things that you're working on in your next project, besides logging, is about the depiction of race and gender and that sort of thing. It makes me think a lot about, I this makes me feel really old, but I grew up with the like projector in class in elementary school. Did you grow up with that, or did you have VHS?
Yeah.
You grew up with
I mean both.
Yeah.
But I remember.
The idea of that sound, that clicking sound, being a regular. I think I probably was the nerd that ran the projector in 5th grade at some point too. But I feel like we watch the same films. I'm wondering where all those movies are now. But we watched a lot of like anthropological films that I bet I would cringe if I went back and saw the sort of like racial attitudes that were given to 5th graders for decades, if not more. When did that begin? When did they start putting newsreels in? Do you know that element? And then I guess I'm asking about your future project too, because it seems like you're heading in a little bit in that direction too.
Yeah. I mean, look, ethnographic film was a part of cinema almost from the beginning. Certainly travel film, which overlaps a lot with ethnographic film, was part of those silent actualities that we were talking about earlier. But so right from the beginning, the newsreel would often have kind of travel segments, or which ultimately were kind of ethnographic in nature. Working along those kind of racist ideas about kind of, a kind of racialized looking, which I do talk about in the book as well, mostly in reference to the Sino-Japanese War, where, the newsreel and, it operationalized a kind of anthropological or ethnographic looking that it flattered white Western audiences and gave, by giving them the ability to see and to watch the spectacle of the other, right? And that was frequently racialized. And one of the things that the newsreel wanted to extol about itself was its power to, it gave you the power to see. Right. And the power to see over long distances, the power to travel virtually. There's all this imagery associated with travel that gets kind of linked to the newsreel in the architecture and the kind of promotional stuff. There's always planes and zeppelins and other kinds of trains. And the idea is that you could, you can journey to faraway places to see these exotic peoples, right? So, I mean, the kind of racialized looking, as well as the gendered looking, because the camera gets personified through these kind of masculine heroes. Cameramen get sort of become kind of pop culture figures in this period. So it's a kind of masculine gaze, male gaze, and an imperial one that imagines the world as kind of available as spectacle. And, this is one of the places where the spectacularization of the news does sort of, it does create a kind of passivity, but in a kind of roundabout way, because it may, I argue in the book that it aligns vision itself with action, right? But by making the cameraman this kind of hero, and they were in comic books, there was movies, fictional movies about newsreel cameramen all over the place.
Wow.
And they were these kind of superheroes.
Yeah.
And so that makes watching the newsreel kind of a kind of action in itself. And so kind of one of those tensions at work is like, the audiences were kind of debating what they were seeing on screen in the newsreel theaters. But ultimately, in the lead up to World War II, for example, watching was enough, right? There was no need for the United States to intervene in the Sino-Japanese War because this was something that was happening over there, and the kind of spectacular relations of racialized looking enabled that kind of disengagement.
Oh,
so
yeah. That's the thing that I think stuck out to me most about your work. The thought that's been racking around in my mind since we scheduled this interview a week ago, and I was reading your stuff and thinking about God, that positionality of consuming history and being like, history is something I watch. History is something I watch on my phone. And to the point where, I mean, I know that's what we've been doing the entire COVID era, even more so, is sort of like retreating into our spaces, whether it be even just on the phone. All that stuff is so heavy. I know you're not the only one working on it, but it feels like your newsreel connection is a really, really vital one. And now I'm thinking about how present all of this stuff was in the 1980s when I was growing up. I don't know if you remember Muppet Babies. You remember Muppet Babies?
Yeah.
I mean, part of the gimmick of Muppet Babies was like, they would open up the door and there would be live action going on outside, but it was always like found footage, newsreels. It was always old time stuff. Pee-wee's Playhouse did that a lot too, where they showed you. So in other words, as a child, I was really watching the 1930s a lot. I mean, it makes me wonder actually if people watch like Little Rascals and all that stuff, which was, I don't know, it's weird to be like 50 years later as a kid watching these like 1930s kids, and yet it was very present in the culture. And I mean, I'm even thinking about Indiana Jones. This is how much your work has stirred up in my mind, Joe. So thank you for joining us. But Indiana Jones, because that's a 1930s story, and it feels like that's very much that image of that strapping white male adventurer who is sort of bringing the exotic world to other Westerners and showing them in a sort of spectacular way. That feels like the movies we watch, and that feels like the 1930s newsreels for sure.
Yeah. So yeah, absolutely. There was a series that was like it was like, I'm forgetting the name of the series. It's basically like boys' adventure careers, and they would like talk about, you could be like they did a book about Arctic explorers. They did one about like being like a kind of being in the Navy, being a firefighter. They were all these like heroic masculine occupations, and newsreel cameraman was amongst those occupations. So I think, yeah, the you could imagine, and there were newsreel characters in comic books who were essentially Indiana Jones, except instead of getting, gold figurines, they were getting footage of, armies in North Africa or something.
Right.
Yeah.
God, it makes me think of Vietnam too, because all those that photographer image is falling apart, and that journalist image is falling apart. I mean, Dennis Hopper in Apocalypse Now is probably a cartoonish version of that, but I think Errol Flynn's son. I mean, speaking of like connections between the old Hollywood and that the 60s counterculture, because Errol Flynn's son was a journalist in Vietnam that I think struggled over there, and it was just very similar to like trying to live out a World War II 1930s 1940s sort of template of adventurism that wasn't really playing in the same way.
Yeah, no, I mean, even now, I remember when like Dan Rather retired, like
Right.
they played his reels from Vietnam now, like in retrospect, as that kind of heroic journalist embedded, and but at the time, journalists, I imagine, were being traumatized by what they were watching in much the same way as the foot soldiers were being, they were also inflicting trauma, but right. But they had to see the war crimes that they were committing or that people were committing alongside them. Yeah.
Yeah. And maybe I think that breaks down that barrier too, because they're like, war is war. And I remember a line in Michael Ayer's Dispatches, which is about Vietnam and journalism and things like that. And one of the World War II veteran journalists who were there alongside the young 60s journalists in Vietnam and said that, you guys are great. Like, what did you think what did you think war was, basically?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of mythology built into that for sure. And
Right.
a lot of masculine mythology for sure.
Absolutely. And it was different in World War II because the cameramen in World War II, they were enlisted, right? So they had been cameramen in the industry, but in order to film the war, they became members of the Signal Corps. So they they enlisted. Their way of serving was to become part of the armed services and film from the battlefront, and then those same images. So I think that's different than the kind of independent, supposedly independent journalists.
Yeah.
Even if there's all kinds of issues with embedding, whether it's in Afghanistan or Iraq or in Vietnam, but nevertheless, it's different than enlisting and becoming a soldier and doing your job as a soldier versus doing your job as a journalist first.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Different political moments, and thank you so much for joining me, Joe, because it makes me think about your work makes me think about all these connections, and particularly you just mentioned Afghanistan, Iraq, all the conversations about embedded journalism. They have a history, and I think very much it's our tendency, especially in history, tends to be just to talk about World War II and the propaganda newsreels there. But your book shows us a whole world of where that stuff comes from that's connected to a lot of really important politics and history that many people aren't thinking about. So thank you for joining me. This was really fun.
Yeah, it was fun for me. Thanks for inviting me.
Okay, huge thank you to my guest, Joe Clark. Go check out his book, News Parade, The American Newsreel and the World as Spectacle. And do your best to support those scholars left out of the academy during a rotten moment in the history of colleges and universities. I know Joe will be back very soon to tell us more about the work he's doing within that whole realm, because it's an important fight, and we're a part of it here on Nostalgia Trap, very much so, as I am one of those scholars that has a PhD and never got a full-time job, and I'm sort of hacking it out on my own, and I'm not alone. And I think that's part of what Nostalgia Trap has given to me, speaking from just a personal place. It's given me a place where I can learn that I'm not alone, and that there is an entire generation of young scholars that are struggling to make a career out of the skills and training that they have. So thanks for the people that are supporting the show and supporting these projects. You can do that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. We've got all sorts of bonus material and other episodes and video lectures and all sorts of stuff on there for those that subscribe. Thanks for those that do that, and we'll talk to you again very soon. All right, take care. Bye-bye.